The scars on Marcus Thompson's face told stories no one wanted to hear. 3 jagged lines ran from his left temple to his jaw, souvenirs from an IED blast in Kandahar that had claimed 2 of his brothers and left him with a face that made children stare and adults look away. The burns on his hands had healed into twisted flesh that made simple tasks like buttoning a shirt a daily reminder of what he'd lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But it wasn't the physical scars that had brought him to this moment. Standing in the sterile conference room of the Riverside Veterans Administration office on a Tuesday morning that felt like Judgment Day, it was the invisible wounds, the ones that made him wake up screaming at 3 a.m., the ones that made him see threats in every shadow, the ones that had cost him 3 jobs in 6 months. Mr. Thompson, Director Janet Walsh's voice cut through the silence like a blade. She sat across from him at the polished conference table, her navy suit crisp and professional, her expression carefully neutral. Behind her, the American flag hung motionless in the stagnant air conditioning. "We've reviewed your file extensively." Marcus kept his hands folded in his lap, the scarred flesh hidden beneath the sleeves of his only good shirt. He'd pressed it himself that morning, the irons, weight familiar in his damaged hands. The shirt was 2 sizes too big now, hanging loose on a frame that had shed 40 pounds since his discharge. Sleep and appetite had become luxuries he couldn't afford. 3 incidents in 6 months, Walsh continued, opening a thick manila folder. The construction site, the warehouse, and the security firm. Each time, your supervisors cited the same concerns: unpredictable behavior, outbursts, inability to work with others. The words hit like body blows, each one a small death. Marcus had heard them before, seen them in the eyes of every hiring manager, every supervisor who'd given him a chance only to watch him fail. The construction foreman called him damaged goods. The warehouse supervisor who'd said he was too unstable for teamwork. The security company owner who'd simply shaken his head and said, "We can't have loose cannons on our team." Marcus Thompson had been many things in his 34 years of life. A high school football star who'd earned a scholarship to state. A Marine who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan with distinction. A squad leader who'd brought his men home alive more times than he could count. But now, sitting in this sterile room with its motivational posters and government-issued furniture, he was something else entirely. A problem to be solved. The incidents weren't. Marcus started, then stopped. How could he explain what it felt like when a car backfired and suddenly he was back in that armored vehicle, watching Rodriguez's blood spray across the dashboard? How could he describe the panic that seized him when someone approached from behind, the way his training kicked in before his mind could catch up? Walsh's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained businesslike. "Mr. Thompson, I want to be clear about something. This administration believes in second chances. We believe in rehabilitation. But we also have responsibilities to the community and to other veterans who need our help." She pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table. The letterhead read, "Pine Ridge Reservation, Cultural Preservation Program." Below it, in simple black text, was a job description that made Marcus's heart sink and soar simultaneously. "One position," Walsh said. "Security and Maintenance Coordinator for the Pine Ridge Cultural Center. It's single quotes S. remote. Isolated. The pay is minimal, barely above subsistence level. The living conditions are basic. No health insurance beyond what the VA provides. And frankly, Mr. Thompson, it's the only opportunity we have left." Marcus picked up the paper with hands that trembled slightly. The job was 300 miles away, in the heart of the Oglala Lakota Nation. He'd be responsible for maintaining the cultural center's buildings, overseeing security, and serving as a liaison between the center and local law enforcement. It was a far cry from the career he'd imagined when he'd first put on the uniform. The tribal council specifically requested a veteran, Walsh continued. Someone who understands duty, honor, sacrifice. They've had problems with outsiders before. People who didn't respect their ways, who saw the position as charity work or some kind of cultural experience. They want someone who understands what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Here he was, a man who'd lost everything in service to his country, being offered a chance to serve again by people whose own country had been taken from them. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a familiar pack. "There's something else," Walsh said, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Off the record, Mr. Thompson, I've seen your military records. I know what you did over there. I know about the villages you protected, the civilians you saved. I know about the Bronze Star you earned, pulling that family from the burning building in Helmand Province." Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd never talked about that day, not to the psychiatrists, not to the counselors, not to anyone. The family had been trapped in the upper floor of a building that had taken a direct hit. The structure was collapsing, smoke and flames pouring from every opening. His squad leader had called for a pullback, but Marcus had seen the children. In the window, heard their cries over the sound of gunfire. "I also know about the nightmares," Walsh continued. "About the survivor's guilt. About the fact that you blame yourself for Rodriguez and Patterson's deaths, even though every report, every witness, every superior officer said there was nothing you could have done differently." The room seemed to shrink around Marcus. The walls pressed in, the air grew thick, and for a moment he was back in that vehicle, watching the world explode in a flash of light and sound and blood. He closed his eyes, counted to 10, used the breathing techniques the VA counselors had taught him. When he opened them, Walsh was watching him with something that might have been understanding. "This position at Pine Ridge," she said quietly. "It's not just a job, Mr. Thompson. It's a chance to be useful again. To protect something worth protecting. The tribal council has been dealing with problems, vandalism, theft, threats from outside. Groups who don't appreciate the cultural preservation work they're doing. They need someone who can stand between them and the darkness." Marcus looked down at the paper again. The salary was indeed minimal, barely enough to cover basic expenses. The housing was described as modest accommodations on reservation grounds. There was no mention of career advancement, no promise of future opportunities, no path back to the life he'd lost. But there was something else in the job description that caught his attention. A single line near the bottom. "Candidates must demonstrate respect for indigenous traditions and willingness to learn from tribal elders." For the first time in months, Marcus felt something other than despair. Not hope exactly, but something like curiosity. He'd spent his adult life in the military, following orders, adhering to structure, serving a cause larger than himself. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn to do it again. "The tribal council wants to meet with you," Walsh said, "face to face. They don't make decisions based on paperwork alone. They want to look you in the eye, hear your voice, judge your character for themselves." Marcus nodded slowly. He understood that kind of evaluation. It was how he'd chosen men for his squad, how he'd separated the reliable from the unreliable, the trustworthy from the rest. Character wasn't something you could fake, not when lives depended on it. "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow. There's a bus that leaves at 6 a.m. The ride takes about 8 hours. You'll have the interview in the afternoon, and if things go well, you could start immediately." Walsh reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small envelope. "Travel expenses," she said. "And Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that I'm recommending you for this position. Not because it's the only option left, but because I think you might be exactly what they're looking for." Marcus stood, his legs unsteady after sitting for so long. The scarred flesh on his hands ached as he gripped the envelope, but he forced himself to meet Walsh's eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate the opportunity. I won't let you down." "Don't let yourself down," she replied. "You've already proven you can serve with honor. Now prove you can heal with honor too." The walk out of the VA building felt different than the walk-in. The Denver sunshine seemed brighter, the air less oppressive. Marcus clutched the envelope and the job description, his mind already racing ahead to tomorrow's journey. He had no idea what awaited him at Pine Ridge, no understanding of the challenges he would face or the people he would meet. But for the first time since that terrible day in Afghanistan, Marcus Thompson had something that had been missing from his life: purpose. The scars on his face caught the light as he walked toward his battered pickup truck, reminders of what he'd lost but also proof of what he'd survived. Tomorrow, he would travel to a place where survival was a way of life, where honor was measured, not in medals but in service to community, where his scars might finally find a place to heal. He didn't know that 12 young women were about to change his life forever, or that his own capacity for protection and sacrifice would be tested in ways he'd never imagined. All he knew was that he had one last chance to prove that Marcus Thompson was more than the sum of his wounds, more than the fears that haunted his sleep, more than the man who'd lost everything in service to his country. He was a protector, a guardian, a warrior who'd found a new battlefield. The drive home took him through neighborhoods he'd grown up in, past the high school where he'd once been a hero, past the recruiting station where he'd sworn his oath so many years ago. Each familiar landmark felt like a goodbye, a final acknowledgement that the life he'd known was over. But as he pulled into the driveway of his small apartment, Marcus Thompson allowed himself something he hadn't felt in months: anticipation. Whatever waited for him at Pine Ridge, whatever test the tribal council had in store, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same determination that had carried him through 3 tours of duty and the long dark months of his return. The scars on his hands gripped the steering wheel, steady and strong. Tomorrow he will begin again. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop at Pine Ridge, South Dakota, its brakes hissing like an old man's final breath. Marcus Thompson shouldered his duffel bag and stepped into air so crisp it cut through his lungs. Like glass. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling hills covered in prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bus station was nothing more than a weathered bench and a faded sign. No crowd of people, no bustling activity, just the vast silence of the Great Plains and a single figure waiting by a dusty pickup truck. The man was tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair braided down his back and weathered hands that spoke of decades working the land. Marcus Thompson? The man's voice carried the weight of mountains and the patience of rivers. "I'm Robert Crowfeather. Tribal Council sent me to fetch you." They shook hands, and Marcus felt the strength in the older man's grip, the kind that came from a lifetime of honest work. Crowfeather's eyes took in the scars on Marcus's face without judgment or pity, just acknowledgement, as if recognizing a fellow survivor. The drive through the reservation revealed a world Marcus had never imagined. Modest homes dotted the landscape, some well-maintained, others showing the wear of poverty and neglect. Children played in yards where chickens pecked at the dirt, their laughter carrying on the wind. Elder women sat on porches, their faces carved by time and wisdom, watching the truck pass with ancient eyes that seemed to see everything. "First time on a reservation?" Crowfeather asked, his hands steady on the wheel as they navigated the rutted road. "Yes, sir." "Drop the sir. We don't stand much ceremony here, just respect." Crowfeather pointed to a cluster of buildings ahead. "That's where you'll be working. The Cultural Center. Been having troubles lately." The Pine Ridge Cultural Center sat on a small rise, its modern architecture blending traditional Native American design with contemporary functionality. The main building was constructed of native stone and timber, its entrance marked by carved totems that told stories Marcus couldn't read. Surrounding it were smaller structures, a museum, workshop spaces, and what looked like ceremonial grounds. But even from a distance, Marcus could see the problems. Graffiti marred the walls of the museum. Windows were boarded up with plywood. A chain-link fence surrounded the entire complex, topped with razor wire that caught the afternoon sun like teeth. "Started about 6 months ago," Crowfeather explained as they pulled into the parking lot. "Vandalism at first. Broken windows, spray paint, garbage dumped on the grounds. Then it escalated. Theft, break-ins. Someone even tried to burn down the workshop where our women make traditional crafts." Marcus stepped out of the truck, his trained eye automatically scanning the perimeter. The fence was adequate, but not professional grade. The lighting was insufficient for proper security. There were too many blind spots, too many approaches. That wouldn't be covered by the basic camera system he could see mounted on the buildings. "Local law enforcement?" Marcus asked. Crowfeather's expression darkened. "Nearest sheriff station is 40 miles away. By the time they get here, whoever's causing trouble is long gone. Besides, some of them aren't too sympathetic to our cause. They see us as troublemakers, asking for handouts, not worth protecting." They walked toward the main building, passing a group of teenagers who were working in a garden. The kids looked up as they approached, their eyes curious but wary. Marcus noticed how they positioned themselves, ready to run if necessary. He recognized the look, had seen it in the eyes of children in Afghan villages who'd learned to fear. "Strangers. The cultural center employs about 30 people," Crowfeather continued. "Mostly women who make traditional crafts, teach classes, preserve our stories and songs. Good people doing important work, but they're scared now. Some have stopped coming, others only work during daylight hours." Inside the main building, the atmosphere was different. The walls were lined with artwork that told the story of the Lakota people, from ancient times through the modern era. Displays showcased traditional clothing, weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects. In one corner, an elderly woman sat at a loom, her fingers working thread into patterns that had been passed down through generations. "Mrs. Little Hawk," Crowfeather called softly. "I'd like you to meet Marcus Thompson, the veteran the council is considering for the security position." The woman looked up, her eyes sharp despite her age. She studied Marcus for a long moment, taking in the scars, the way he carried himself, the careful respect in his posture. Then she nodded once and returned to her work. "She doesn't speak much English," Crowfeather explained. "But she sees more than most. Her granddaughter is one of our young women working here. Bright girl, studying to be a teacher, but she's been having nightmares since the trouble started." They continued through the center, passing workshops where artisans created jewelry, pottery, and traditional weapons. Marcus noticed how the workers kept glancing toward the windows, how they startled at unexpected sounds. These people were living in fear, and it reminded him too much of the villages he'd tried to protect overseas. "The tribal council will meet with you in an hour," Crowfeather said as they climbed stairs to the second floor. 5 members, all elders. "They'll want to hear your story, judge your character. But I'll tell you something first that might help you understand what you're walking into." They entered a small office with windows overlooking the ceremonial grounds. Crowfeather gestured for Marcus to sit, then pulled out a folder thick with photographs and police reports. "This isn't random vandalism," he said, spreading the photos across the desk. "Someone's targeting us specifically. Look at this." The photographs showed the progression of incidents over the past 6 months. The early vandalism had been crude, typical teenage mischief. But the more recent incidents showed planning, organization, specific knowledge of the center's operations. Windows broken during important ceremonies. Threats spray-painted in locations that would cause maximum psychological impact. Equipment stolen that was particularly valuable or difficult to replace. Whoever's doing this knows our schedules, our routines, Crowfeather said. They know when we're vulnerable, when we're distracted. This isn't some drunk college kids looking for trouble. This is organized harassment. Marcus studied the photos with the analytical eye he'd developed in the military. Any suspects? Threats from specific groups? There's been tension with some of the neighboring communities. People who think we get too much government assistance, who resent our sovereignty, our tax exemptions. There's a group that meets in town, calls itself the Patriots for Fair Treatment. They claim they just want equal treatment for all citizens. But their rhetoric has been getting more aggressive. Crowfeather pulled out a newspaper clipping showing a town hall meeting. Marcus could see the anger in the faces of the crowd, the way they leaned forward, aggressive and confrontational. He'd seen similar expressions in villages where insurgents had turned the population against coalition forces. Then there's the development issue, Crowfeather continued. Mining company wants to lease land near here for a copper extraction operation. We've been fighting it, saying it would destroy sacred sites and contaminate the water supply. They've been pressuring the tribal council, making offers, trying to find ways around our objections. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. This wasn't just about security. It was about culture, politics, economics, and the age-old struggle between preservation and progress. The young women who work here, Crowfeather said, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. They're the future of our people. Teachers, artists, keepers of our traditions, but they're also the most vulnerable. Some of the threats have been specific, personal, targeting them individually. The weight of responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a familiar burden. He'd protected villages, convoys, forward operating bases. But this felt different, more personal. These weren't just civilians in a war zone. These were people trying to preserve something precious, something that could be lost forever if the wrong forces prevailed. There's something else, Crowfeather said, hesitating. Something the council will want to discuss with you. We've heard rumors, nothing confirmed, but rumors about something bigger being planned. Something that will happen soon, maybe during our autumn festival next week. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something? The kind that would shut us down permanently. Discredit us, maybe get our federal funding pulled. The kind that would give certain interested parties an excuse to move in and take what they want. Crowfeather leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus intently. The question is, can one scarred veteran stand against that kind of pressure? Can you be what these people need you to be? Before Marcus could answer, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts, the sound of running feet, a car engine revving aggressively. Both men rushed to the window to see a black pickup truck speeding away from the center, leaving a cloud of dust and the acrid smell of burning rubber dot in the parking lot below. A group of young women had gathered around something on the ground. Even from the second floor, Marcus could see their distress, the way they hugged each other, the fear in their body language. "Come on," Crowfeather said grimly. "Looks like the troubles have found us again." They hurried downstairs and outside, where Marcus got his first clear look at the 12 young women who would soon change his life forever. They ranged in age from late teens to mid-20s, each one unique but connected by bonds of culture and community that went deeper than kung fu. Blood. There was Ayana, tall and graceful with paint-stained fingers from her art classes. Winona, compact and fierce, her medical textbooks scattered around her feet. Kaya, barely 18 but already showing the wisdom of someone who'd grown up too fast. Sitlali, her long black hair catching the late afternoon sun as she comforted the youngest of the group, and standing at their center, trying to calm the others while maintaining her own composure, was Nayeli. She couldn't have been more than 22, but she carried herself with the authority of someone twice her age. Her dark eyes flashed with anger and determination as she looked at what lay on the ground between them. It was a dead hawk. Its magnificent wings spread wide, its body mutilated in a way that suggested ritual rather than accident. Tied around its neck was a note written in crude letters. Your protection ends soon. Choose wisely. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the implications of the threat sank in. This wasn't vandalism or theft. This was a declaration of war against everything the cultural center represented. Marcus knelt beside the bird, his military training automatically cataloging details. The kill was fresh within the last hour. The mutilation showed knowledge of Native American symbolism, a deliberate desecration designed to cause maximum psychological impact. The note was written on common paper with a felt-tip pen, but the handwriting suggested someone educated, controlled, not the work of a random troublemaker. The hawk is sacred to our people, Nayeli said, her voice steady despite the tremor Marcus could detect underneath. It represents protection, vision, the connection between earth and sky. Killing one like this, leaving it here. She trailed off, but Marcus understood that it was a message, a threat. A promise that the protection these young women depended on was about to be stripped away. As Marcus stood, he caught Nayeli's eye. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. She saw in his scarred face a man who had faced darkness before and survived. He saw in her determined gaze a spirit that refused to be broken, no matter what forces arrayed against it. Mr. Thompson, Crowfeather said quietly, I think it's time you met the tribal council. And I think they're going to be very interested in what you have to offer. As they walked toward the main building, Marcus felt the weight of 12 pairs of eyes on his back. He didn't know their names yet, didn't understand the full scope of what they faced, didn't realize that his decision to accept this position would put him at the center of a conflict that went far deeper than simple harassment. But he knew, with the certainty that had kept him alive through 3 tours of combat, that these young women were worth protecting, that this place, with its sacred traditions and precious heritage, was worth defending. And that somewhere in the gathering darkness, forces were moving that would test every skill he'd learned, every principle he held, every oath he'd ever taken. The dead hawk lay behind them in the dust, its sightless eyes reflecting the dying light. But ahead, in the sacred spaces of the cultural center, 12 young women continued their work of preservation and hope, trusting that somehow, someway, protection would come. They had no idea that their guardian had already arrived. Scarred, broken, carrying wounds that might never fully heal, but still capable of standing between them and the storm that was coming. Marcus Thompson had found his purpose again. Now he just had to prove he was worthy of it. The tribal council chamber felt older than time itself. 5 elders sat in a semicircle, their faces bearing the accumulated wisdom of decades spent watching the world change around them. The walls were adorned with photographs spanning generations, from sepia-toned portraits of warriors in traditional dress to modern images of children, learning their ancestral language in bright classrooms. Marcus Thompson sat across from them, his hands resting carefully on his knees, acutely aware that this moment would determine not just his future, but possibly the fate of the 12 young women whose frightened faces still haunted his thoughts. The dead hawk had been removed, but its message lingered like smoke in the air. Tell us about Afghanistan, said Council Chief Maria Whitefeather, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had negotiated with federal officials and corporate executives for 40 years. Her silver hair was braided with turquoise beads that caught the light as she leaned forward. Not the official version. The real story. Marcus had prepared for questions about his qualifications, his plans for securing the cultural center, his understanding of Native American traditions. He hadn't expected this directness, this immediate cutting to the heart of who he was beneath the uniform and the medals and the carefully constructed resume. Afghanistan changed me, he began, then stopped. The words felt inadequate, like trying to describe an ocean to someone who had never seen water. I went there believing in simple things, good and evil, right and wrong, us and them. Chief White Feather nodded encouragingly. Beside her, Thomas Strongheart, the council's eldest member at 87, studied Marcus with eyes that had seen the boarding schools, the government relocations, the systematic attempts to erase his people's culture. To his left sat Sarah. Blackhorse, barely 50, but already carrying the weight of being the first woman lawyer in her family's history. Next to her was David Spotted Eagle, whose grandfather had fought at Little Bighorn. And finally Raymond Clearwater, a Vietnam veteran, whose own scars were hidden beneath his traditional ribbon shirt. The village was called Cargay, Marcus continued, his voice growing steadier as he found his rhythm. Small place, maybe 300 people, mostly farmers trying to survive in the middle of a war they didn't start and couldn't control. My unit was supposed to establish a forward operating base there, build relationships with the locals, gather intelligence about Taliban movement in the region. He paused, seeing not the council chamber but the dusty streets of that distant village. Feeling the weight of gear on his shoulders, tasting the ever-present grit in the air. The village elder was a man named Haji Ahmad, probably 70 years old. Bent with arthritis, but he carried himself like a king. Reminded me of my grandfather, actually. Same dignity, same quiet strength. Thomas Strongheart made a small sound of understanding. The parallel wasn't lost on any of them. Ahmad tried to warn us, Marcus said. In broken English mixed with Pashto and hand gestures, he tried to tell us we were in danger. Not from his people, but from outside forces that wanted to use the village as a battleground. We thought we knew better. We had training, equipment, intelligence reports. What could an old Afghan farmer tell us that our commanders didn't already know? The weight of that arrogance, that failure to listen, settled on Marcus's shoulders like a physical burden. In this room, surrounded by people whose ancestors had faced similar dismissal from outsiders who thought they knew better, the parallel felt especially sharp. 3 weeks later, the Taliban moved in. Not soldiers, but men who looked like farmers, talked like neighbors, claimed to be fighting for the village's protection against foreign invaders. They set up in the mosque, the school, places we couldn't attack without destroying what we were supposed to be protecting. Sarah Blackhorse leaned forward slightly. What did you do? We tried to work within the rules of engagement. Minimal force, avoid civilian casualties, respect religious sites. But the Taliban didn't follow those rules. They used children as human shields, stored weapons in the school, set up sniper positions in the minaret. Every day, the situation got worse. Marcus could feel the phantom weight of his rifle, smell the smoke from cooking fires mixed with diesel fuel and cordite. Haji Ahmad came to me one night. Snuck past our perimeter guards like a ghost, which should have been impossible given our security measures. Found me in my quarters and sat down like we were old friends sharing tea. He looked directly at Chief Whitefeather. He told me his people were caught between two armies, both claiming to protect them, both bringing nothing but death. He said his granddaughter, a girl about 16 who helped teach the younger children, had been threatened by Taliban fighters who wanted to use the school as a weapons cache. He asked me what I would do if it was my granddaughter. The silence in the council chamber stretched like a held breath. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the walls with golden light that seemed to make the ancestors in the photographs come alive. I made a decision that night, Marcus said. Not as a soldier following orders, but as a human being who couldn't watch innocent people suffer. I gathered my squad, men I trusted with my life, and told them we were going to evacuate the village, all of them, women, children, elders, everyone. Raymond Clearwater, the Vietnam veteran, shifted in his chair. He understood the weight of decisions made in impossible circumstances, the burden of choosing between duty and conscience. It took 2 days, Marcus continued. We moved them in small groups during darkness, using routes Ahmad showed us through terrain our maps said was impassable. Old goat paths, dry creek beds, caves that had hidden his people during the Soviet occupation 20 years earlier. He paused, remembering the faces of the children who had trusted him enough to leave the only home they'd ever known. The Taliban. Caught on during the second night. They knew they were losing their human shields, their strategic positions. They came after us hard. The ambush had happened at dawn on the third day, just as they were evacuating the last group. Marcus had been helping an elderly woman carry her few possessions when the first shots rang out. His squad had performed exactly as trained, taking defensive positions, returning fire, calling for air support. Rodriguez and Patterson died covering the withdrawal, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 of the best men I ever served with. They could have pulled back, could have saved themselves. But they stayed in position until every villager was clear. The explosion that had scarred Marcus's face and hands had come later, when he'd gone back for Rodriguez's body. The IED had been hidden beneath his friend's gear. A final insult from an enemy that understood the American military's commitment to leaving no one behind. The official report called it a successful humanitarian operation, Marcus said. 300 civilians evacuated to safety. Taliban stronghold neutralized. Minimal friendly casualties. Clean, professional, by the book. Chief Whitefeather's expression hadn't changed, but Marcus could see understanding in her eyes. But that's not how it felt. No, ma'am. It felt like failure. Like if I'd listened to Sinmad from the beginning. If I'd trusted his knowledge of his own land over our intelligence reports, Rodriguez and Patterson might still be alive. The village might still be standing instead of being reduced to rubble. Thomas Strongheart spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades. You carry the deaths of your friends as if they were your fault. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded anyway. And the villagers? The 300 people you saved? Do you think Ahmad's granddaughter blames you for the destruction of her school? Marcus looked up, startled by the perspective. In the 2 years since his discharge, he'd focused so intensely on what he'd lost, what he'd failed to protect, that he'd barely considered what had been saved. Survivor's guilt is a heavy burden, David Spotted Eagle said quietly. Our warriors have carried it for generations. The ones who came home from battles where their brothers fell. The children who survived the boarding schools while their friends died of disease and despair. The families who made it through the government relocations while others were lost along the way. Sarah Blackhorse opened a folder on her lap and pulled out several sheets of paper. We received these yesterday, she said, handing them to Marcus. Background checks, military records, statements from your former commanding officers. They paint a different picture than the one you've been telling yourself. Marcus looked down at the documents, recognizing his own service record viewed through official eyes. Commendations for valor, efficiency reports praising his leadership, testimonials from soldiers who had served under him. Staff Sergeant Miguel. Rodriguez's final letter to his family, Sarah continued, producing another document, written 3 days before he died. He specifically mentions you, Mr. Thompson, says you were the finest squad leader he'd ever served under, that he'd follow you anywhere because you never forgot that the mission was about protecting people, not just completing objectives. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He'd never seen Rodriguez's final letter, never known that his friend had written about him in those last days. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, Sarah continued, your commanding officer during your 3rd deployment. His statement says, and I quote, Sergeant Thompson consistently demonstrated the highest standards of moral courage and tactical competence. His actions during the Karga village evacuation saved hundreds of civilian lives and exemplified the best traditions of the United States Marine Corps. Raymond Clearwater leaned forward. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Those aren't signs of weakness, son. They're the price of caring too much, of carrying responsibility for others when the world tries to convince you that only results matter. Marcus felt something shifting inside him, a weight he'd carried for 2 years beginning to redistribute itself across his shoulders. Not disappearing, he understood now that it never would, but becoming bearable. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Chief Whitefeather smiled, the first time her expression had softened since he'd entered the chamber. "Because the young women working at our cultural center need a protector who understands that some things are worth sacrificing for. Someone who knows the difference between duty to authority and duty to people." She gestured toward the photographs. On the walls, our own warriors faced impossible choices. Stand and fight against overwhelming odds, or watch their families be destroyed. Resist the government agents who came to take our children, or see them disappear forever. Preserve our language and traditions in secret, or lose them completely. Thomas Strongheart rose slowly from his chair and walked to one of the photographs, a formal portrait of a young man in cavalry uniform from the 1880s. "My great-grandfather, Joseph Strongheart. He joined the U.S. Army to feed his family during the reservation years. Fought against other tribes, followed orders that sometimes meant destroying people who shared his blood. He carried that burden his whole life." He turned back to Marcus. "But he also used his position to warn villages of impending raids, to smuggle food to families facing starvation, to protect what he could while serving a system that wanted to destroy his people. The contradictions nearly broke him, but he understood that sometimes you serve the greater good by finding ways to resist from within." The parallel was unmistakable. Marcus was being offered more than a job. He was being offered a chance to transform his guilt into purpose, his pain into protection. "The 12 young women you saw today," Chief Whitefeather said, "represent something precious. Not just to our tribe, but to the world. They're teachers, artists, healers, scholars. They carry our stories, our songs, our traditions into the future. Without them, a piece of human heritage dies forever." She pulled out another folder, this one thick with photographs and documents. Ayanna Brokenwing, 24, art teacher and muralist. Her great-grandmother was one of the last traditional beadworkers, and Ayanna is documenting those techniques before they're lost. She's already had death threats because her murals tell the true history of government policies toward our people. The photograph showed a young woman with paint-stained fingers, her eyes bright with intelligence and determination. Marcus remembered her from the parking lot, the way she'd tried to shield the younger women from seeing the mutilated hawk. Winona Ghosthorse, 23, pre-med student and traditional medicine keeper. She's working to bridge Western medical practices with our ancestral healing traditions. Last month, someone broke into her apartment and destroyed 2 years of research notes. Another photograph, another face that had looked to him with desperate hope when the truck had sped away. The chief continued through all 12, each name carrying the weight of heritage and hope. Mayeli Rainwater, the unofficial leader of the group, studying to be a tribal attorney like Sarah Blackhorse. Kaya Blue Eagle, barely 18, but already showing promise as a traditional singer and storyteller. Sitlali Morningstar, whose skill with traditional crafts had earned her recognition from museums across the country. "They work here because it's safe," Chief Whitefeather said. Or it was safe. Their families send them here knowing they'll be protected while they learn and grow and prepare to lead our people into the future. But that safety is disappearing. She closed the folder and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "We're not asking you to die for them, Mr. Thompson. We're asking you to live for them. To find a way to carry your skills, your experience, your understanding of sacrifice, and use them to protect something that can't be replaced." The weight of responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders, but this time it felt different. Not the crushing burden of guilt and failure, but the familiar, almost comforting weight of a mission that mattered. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said. David's spotted eagle leaned forward. "Be their guardian. Not just their security guard, but their protector in the truest sense. Live among them, learn from them, help them understand the dangers they face while preserving their ability to do the work that matters." "The threats are escalating," Sarah added. "What happened today with the hawk? That was a warning. Our sources suggest something bigger is coming, probably during next week's autumn festival. Hundreds of visitors, media coverage, tribal leaders from across the region. The perfect opportunity for someone to cause maximum damage and embarrassment." Raymond Clearwater stood and walked to the window, looking out at the cultural center where lights were beginning to come on in the evening darkness. "Those 12 young women trust us to keep them safe. They trust that when they leave their families to come here, to take risks by preserving traditions that some people want to see disappear, we'll be there to protect them." He turned back to Marcus. "We're asking you to be worthy of that trust, to take everything you learned about protection in Afghanistan and apply it here, in defense of something just as precious as any village you ever tried to save." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and responsibility. Marcus thought of Haji Ahmad, of the granddaughter the old man had been so desperate to protect. He thought of Rodriguez and Patterson, of the price they'd paid to ensure that protection meant something. And he thought of 12 young women who carried the future of their people in their hands, who deserved to pursue their calling without fear, who needed someone willing to stand between them and the forces that would silence them forever. Marcus Thompson had spent 2 years wondering if his sacrifices had meant anything, if the scars he carried had any purpose beyond marking him as damaged goods. Now in this room filled with the wisdom of generations, he finally understood. The scars weren't signs of failure. They were proof of his willingness to pay the price for protection. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, 12 young women were waiting to discover if that protection would be enough. The decision came easier than Marcus had expected. Sitting in that council chamber, surrounded by photographs of warriors and survivors, listening to the stories of 12 young women whose only crime was wanting to preserve their heritage, he felt something click into place, like a weapon being loaded, a mission being accepted, a purpose being found. "I'll do it," he said simply. Chief Whitefeather nodded as if she'd never doubted his answer. "Good. You start tomorrow. Robert will show you to your quarters tonight, and in the morning, you'll meet with each of the young women individually. They need to trust you, and you need to understand what you're protecting." The quarters turned out to be a small apartment above the cultural center's maintenance building. One room with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and windows that offered strategic views of the entire complex. Military-style functionality that felt more like home than any place. Marcus had lived since his discharge. He spent his first night studying building plans and security protocols, identifying weaknesses and blind spots, with the methodical precision that had kept his squad alive in hostile territory. The existing security system was laughably inadequate. A few cameras, motion sensors on the main doors, and a fence that could be breached with wire cutters and 5 minutes of privacy. But as dawn broke over the South Dakota prairie, Marcus realized that traditional security measures might not be enough. The enemies they faced weren't just common criminals or random vandals. They were organized, patient, and intimately familiar with the cultural center's operations. This required a different approach. His first meeting was with Nayeli Rainwater at 7 a.m. in the center's main conference room. She arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a professional blazer that couldn't quite hide the wariness in her dark eyes. At 22, she moved with the confidence of someone who'd been forced to grow up fast, but Marcus could see the vulnerability underneath. "Mr. Thompson," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, direct, but he noticed the slight tremor. That suggested she was more nervous than she appeared. I'm the unofficial coordinator for our group. The others look to me for guidance, which means I need to know if you're someone we can trust. Marcus appreciated her directness. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to value people who said what they meant without diplomatic dancing. What do you need to know? Nayeli pulled out a thick folder and spread photographs across the conference table. But these weren't the formal headshots Chief Whitefeather had shown him. These were surveillance photos, taken with telephoto lenses from hidden positions. Photos of the 12 young women going about their daily lives, unaware they were being watched. These started appearing under our car windshields 3 weeks ago. Nayeli said, her voice steady despite the disturbing nature of the images. Someone's been following us, learning our routines, our habits, where we live, where we shop, who we spend time with. Marcus studied the photos with a growing alarm. The level of surveillance was professional, systematic. Ayanna leaving her apartment building at precisely 7:15 a.m. every morning. Winona studying at the same table in the tribal college library every Tuesday and Thursday. Kaya walking her grandmother's dog along the same route every evening. Have you changed your routine since discovering this? Marcus asked. Some of us have tried, but it's not that simple. We have jobs, classes, family obligations. And honestly, we're not trained for this kind of thing. We're teachers and artists and students, not soldiers. The next photo made Marcus's blood run cold. It showed Sitlali Morningstar, the youngest of the group at barely 18, walking alone from her job at the tribal health clinic to her car in the parking lot. But she wasn't alone in the photo. A man in dark clothing was visible in the background, clearly following her, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. This was taken last Friday, Nayeli said. Sitlali didn't know she was being followed until she got to her car and found this photo under her windshield wiper, along with this. She handed Marcus a note written in the same crude lettering as the message attached to the dead hawk. Pretty girl. Walks alone. Convenient. The threat was unmistakable, and Marcus felt the familiar ice-cold rage that had sustained him through 3 combat deployments. Someone was hunting these women, studying them like prey, preparing for something that would require intimate knowledge of their movements and vulnerabilities. Have you gone to the police? Nayeli's expression hardened. The tribal police are spread too thin, and the county sheriff's department has made it clear they consider this an internal tribal matter. They suggested we hire private security if we're concerned. Marcus filed that information away. No outside help, limited resources, and enemies who operated with impunity. It was starting to feel disturbingly familiar. Tell me about the others, he said. I need to understand each woman's specific situation. Her vulnerabilities, what makes her a target. For the next hour, Nayeli provided intelligence that would have impressed any military briefing officer. She'd systematically documented each woman's background, daily routine, living situation, and potential risk factors. It was clear she'd been thinking about protection and security long before Marcus arrived. Ayanna Brokenwing lived alone in a converted garage apartment behind her elderly aunt's house. The location was isolated, accessible by a long gravel driveway. That provided no witnesses and multiple escape routes for anyone with malicious intent. Her work required her to stay late at the cultural center several nights a week, often leaving after dark when the building was otherwise empty. Winona, Ghost Horse's pre-med studies required her to commute to the state university 3 days a week. A 90-minute drive each way through sparsely populated countryside. Her research into traditional medicine had already drawn criticism from certain pharmaceutical companies, who saw her work as a threat to their market dominance in tribal healthcare. The pattern continued through all 12 women. Each had been carefully studied, their movements tracked, their vulnerabilities cataloged. This wasn't random harassment. It was preparation for something specific, When's the autumn festival? Marcus asked. Next Friday through Sunday. 3 days of cultural demonstrations, traditional foods, storytelling, and dancing. We expect about 800 visitors from across the region, plus media coverage and tribal dignitaries. Nayeli's expression grew troubled. All 12 of us will be working the event. Demonstrations, performances, educational presentations. We'll be completely exposed, surrounded by crowds of strangers. Marcus felt his tactical mind engaging, analyzing the situation like a military operation. Large crowds provided cover for hostile actors. Multiple entry and exit points made perimeter security nearly impossible. The presence of media and tribal leaders would amplify the impact of any successful attack. Who knows the festival schedule? The specific assignments for each woman? It's been posted on our website for months. Anyone could access it. Nayeli paused, then added quietly, "We also sent detailed itineraries to several partner organizations, including some of the museums and universities that have been pressuring us to loan artifacts for their collections." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Economic pressure disguised as academic interest. Marcus had seen similar tactics in Afghanistan, where insurgents often recruited local assets by offering money or threatening economic retaliation. "I need to meet with each of the others individually," Marcus said. "Today, if possible. And I need complete honesty about any threats, any unusual incidents, any people or organizations that have made them uncomfortable." Nayeli nodded. "I've already arranged it. Ayanna will be here at 9, Winona at 10:30, and so on throughout the day. But Mr. Thompson, there's something else you need to know." She pulled out one final photograph, this one different from the surveillance images. It showed a group of men in military-style clothing standing around a pickup truck loaded with camping gear. They looked like weekend warriors playing soldier, but Marcus's trained eye caught details that suggested otherwise. The way they positioned themselves showed tactical awareness. Their equipment was high quality, not surplus store replicas. And most telling, they carried themselves with the confidence of people who'd used their weapons for more than target practice. "This was taken at a gun show in Rapid City 2 weeks ago," Nayeli said. The man on the left is Derek Hutchins, leader of the Patriots for Fair Treatment group that's been agitating against tribal sovereignty. The man next to him is Brad Kowalski, a former military contractor who owns a private security company. Marcus studied the faces, committing them to memory. Hutchins looked like a middle-aged insurance salesman playing dress-up, but Kowalski had the hard edges of someone who'd seen real combat. The combination of ideological fervor and professional expertise was dangerous. "How did you get this photo?" "One of our cousins works at the convention center where the gun show was held. She recognized some of the rhetoric from their public meetings and thought we should know they were organizing. Smart girl." Marcus made a mental note to recommend Nayeli for intelligence work if she ever decided to change careers. "What else do you know about these groups?" "The Patriots claim they just want equal treatment for all citizens, but their private meetings tell a different story. They believe tribal sovereignty is unconstitutional, that we get unfair advantages in taxation and business development. They want our federal recognition revoked, our treaties nullified." Marcus nodded grimly. He'd encountered similar attitudes during his brief attempt at civilian employment. The belief that Native Americans were somehow getting special treatment, rather than honoring agreements made in exchange for millions of acres of stolen land. "Kowalski's company has been hired by the mining corporation that wants to lease land near here," Nayeli continued. "Officially, they're providing security for the company's geological surveys. Unofficially, they've been harassing anyone who opposes the mining operation." The meeting was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. Ayanna Brokenwing entered, her long black hair tied back in a practical ponytail, her fingers stained with paint from whatever project she'd Been working on. She moved with the cautious grace of someone who'd learned to be constantly alert. Nayeli, she said, then turned to Marcus with curious but wary eyes. You must be our new guardian angel. Marcus almost smiled at the description. With his scarred face and damaged hands, he was probably the least angelic-looking protector they could have found. But as Ayanna took a seat at the conference table, he saw something in her expression that reminded him of the Afghan children he'd tried so hard to keep safe. A combination of hope and fear, trust and wariness, that said she desperately wanted to believe someone could protect her but had learned through bitter experience not to count on it. Tell me about your work, Marcus said. What you do here, why it matters, what makes you a target. Ayanna's expression brightened slightly as she spoke about her art, the traditional technique she was documenting, the mural she was painting that told the true history of her people. But the light in her eyes dimmed when she described the reactions her work had generated. The mural in the tribal college library has been vandalized 3 times, she said. Someone keeps spray painting over the section that depicts the Wounded Knee massacre. They leave notes calling it revisionist propaganda and anti-American lies. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The Wounded Knee massacre was historical fact, documented by military reports and eyewitness accounts. Calling it propaganda was like denying the Holocaust or claiming the Civil War wasn't about slavery. The latest threat was more specific, Ayanna continued, pulling out her phone to show Marcus a text message that had arrived just that morning. Pretty pictures won't save you when your protection disappears. Enjoy the festival. The message had been sent from a burner phone, untraceable but clearly coordinated with the other threats. Someone was escalating their timeline, building toward the festival as a deadline for action. As Marcus spent the day meeting with each of the 12 young women, a disturbing pattern emerged. The threats weren't random or opportunistic. They were carefully crafted to exploit each woman's specific fears and vulnerabilities. Winona, Ghost Horse, had received threats targeting her research into traditional medicine, with implications that her work was dangerous to public health. Kaya Blue Eagle had been told that her traditional songs were primitive noise that had no place in modern society. Sitlali Morningstar had received the most personal attacks, with references to her youth and appearance that carried unmistakable sexual menace. Each woman had tried to continue her work despite the threats, but Marcus could see the toll it was taking. They moved differently now, constantly alert, checking over their shoulders, jumping at unexpected sounds. They were beginning to change their behavior, limiting their movements, avoiding certain areas, second-guessing every decision. It was exactly what their enemies wanted. Fear was a weapon, and it was being used with surgical precision to disrupt the cultural center's operations without leaving fingerprints or evidence that would stand up in court. By late afternoon, Marcus had compiled a threat assessment that would have impressed his old intelligence officers. Multiple hostile actors with varying capabilities and motivations. Professional surveillance and harassment techniques. Escalating timeline focused on the upcoming festival. Clear intent to disrupt or destroy the cultural preservation. Work being done by the 12 women. But what worried him most was the coordination. The Patriots for Fair Treatment, Kowalski Security Company, the Mining Corporation, and possibly others were working together with a level of sophistication that suggested professional planning and substantial resources. As the sun set over the South Dakota prairie, Marcus stood at the window of his apartment, looking down at the cultural center where lights were beginning to come on. Somewhere in those buildings, 12 young women were finishing their work for the day, preparing to go home to apartments and houses that offered the illusion of safety but no real protection. In 6 days, they would be completely exposed at the autumn festival, surrounded by crowds and chaos, performing the traditional dances and songs that someone was determined to silence forever. Marcus had 6 days to figure out how to protect them against enemies who knew their every move, had professional military training, and operated with the blessing of people who saw Native Americans as obstacles to progress rather than human beings deserving of respect. 6 days to prove that a scarred veteran with PTSD could be the guardian these women needed. 6 days to show that some things were still worth protecting, even when the odds were impossible and the cost was everything. As darkness fell over Pine Ridge, Marcus Thompson began planning for war. Not the kind fought with artillery and air strikes, but the kind waged in shadows and silence, where the difference between victory and defeat was measured not in territory gained, but in lives preserved. The enemy was coming. The only question was whether he would be ready when they arrived. The autumn festival dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight painting the rolling hills of Pine Ridge in shades of amber and rust. By 8 a.m., the cultural center's grounds were already bustling with activity as vendors set up booths selling traditional crafts. Food preparations began for the communal feast, and sound technicians tested equipment for the afternoon performances. Marcus Thompson had been awake since 4 a.m., conducting his third perimeter sweep of the morning. 6 days of intensive preparation had transformed the cultural center's security from laughable to professional. Motion sensors now covered every approach. Wireless cameras provided overlapping coverage with no blind spots. Emergency communication protocols connected every building to a central command post he'd established in the maintenance office, but technology could only do so much. The real security came from the network of allies Marcus had quietly recruited over the past week. Robert Crowfeather's grandson, a Marine veteran who'd served in Iraq, was managing parking and vehicle screening. 3 off-duty tribal police officers, borrowed from neighboring reservations, were working crowd control in plainclothes. Even some of the women's family members had volunteered to help, positioning themselves throughout the festival grounds with radios and carefully concealed responsibilities. The 12 young women had thrown themselves into festival preparations with determined enthusiasm, refusing to let fear dictate their actions. Ayanna had created a massive mural that served as the backdrop for the main stage, depicting the history of the Lakota people in brilliant colors that seemed to dance in the morning light. Winona had organized a traditional medicine demonstration that was already drawing interested crowds. Nayeli moved through the preparations like a general coordinating troops, ensuring every detail was perfect. But Marcus could see the tension in their movements, the way their eyes constantly scanned the growing crowds, the subtle positioning that kept them within sight of each other and the emergency exits he'd drilled them on all week. They were trying to be normal, but normal had been stolen from them by months of systematic harassment. At 10:47 a.m., the first probe came. Marcus was checking the perimeter when his radio crackled with a report from the parking area. "Command, this is parking control. We've got a vehicle circling the lot, dark blue pickup with 2 male occupants. Third pass now, no attempt to park." Marcus keyed his radio. "Copy, parking control. Get me a plate number and description of occupants." Within minutes, the information came back. The pickup was registered to Derek Hutchins, leader of the Patriots for Fair Treatment. The passenger matched the description of Brad Kowalski, the military contractor whose security company had been harassing tribal opponents of the mining operation. They weren't trying to hide their presence. This was intimidation, a message that they were watching, waiting, ready to act. Marcus felt the familiar pre-combat tension settling into his muscles, the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through 3 deployments. "All stations, be advised we have confirmed hostile surveillance," Marcus transmitted. "Maintain normal operations but increase vigilance." The festival officially opened at noon with a welcoming ceremony led by Chief White Feather. Nearly 600 visitors had already arrived, with more streaming in every hour. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, filled with laughter and music and the rich smells of traditional foods. Children ran between the booths while their parents examined handcrafted jewelry and pottery. Elder storytellers drew crowds of rapt listeners, eager to hear ancient tales passed down through generations. It should have been perfect. It would have been perfect, if not for the predators circling just beyond the light. At 1:15 p.m., the second probe came. A group of 4 men in military-style clothing appeared at the main entrance, claiming to be journalists interested in covering the cultural preservation work. They had press credentials that looked legitimate at first glance, but Marcus's trained eye caught the subtle tells that marked them as fakes. The lamination was too new, the typeface slightly wrong, the photographs unprofessional. "I'm sorry, gentlemen," Marcus said politely as he intercepted them at the gate. "All media personnel need to be pre-registered with the tribal council. I can put you in touch with our public relations coordinator if you'd like to arrange coverage for next year's festival." The lead man, a stocky individual with close-cropped hair and the bearing of ex-military, smiled without warmth. "That's unfortunate. We've driven quite a distance to be here today." "I understand your disappointment," Marcus replied, maintaining his professional demeanor while cataloging details. The man's boots were military issue. His cargo pants had equipment loops that suggested he was used to carrying weapons and tactical gear. His companions positioned themselves with the automatic spacing of people trained to work as a team. "Perhaps you'd be interested in some of our publicly available materials?" He handed them a festival brochure, noting how the leader's eyes immediately went to the performance schedule that listed when each of the 12 women would be presenting their demonstrations. The man accepted the brochure with another cold smile, made a show of studying it, then looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "We'll be seeing you again real soon," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The men withdrew to the parking lot, but Marcus could see them through the security cameras, making phone calls and studying the festival layout. They were conducting reconnaissance, gathering final intelligence for whatever operation they'd planned. At 2:30 p.m., Ayanna took the main stage for her presentation on traditional art techniques. She moved with the confidence of someone in her element, explaining the symbolism behind traditional beadwork patterns, while demonstrating techniques that had been passed down through her family for generations. The crowd was captivated, drawn into her passion for preserving these ancient skills. Marcus watched from the security office, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd through multiple camera feeds. Everything looked normal, too normal. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to fear the quiet moments, the times when everything seemed peaceful, but something indefinable felt wrong. At 2:47 p.m., that indefinable wrongness crystallized into action. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinated with military precision. A smoke grenade detonated near the main stage, sending visitors into confused panic. Emergency alarms began blaring from the museum building, suggesting a fire or break-in. And in the parking lot, someone began slashing tires on vehicles belonging to tribal council members and visiting dignitaries. It was a classic diversion tactic, designed to split security forces and create chaos that would mask the real objective. Marcus keyed his radio as he sprinted toward the main stage. "All stations, we are under coordinated attack. Museum team, respond to the alarm. Parking team, secure the lot. Everyone else, converge on the main stage and protect the women." Through the dissipating smoke, Marcus could see Ayanna standing frozen at the microphone, her eyes wide with fear as the crowd scattered in confusion. But she wasn't alone on the stage. 3 men in dark clothing had appeared from behind the backdrop, moving with purpose toward her position. Marcus reached the stage just as the lead attacker grabbed Ayanna's arm. His scarred hands closed around the man's wrist with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning how to neutralize threats without killing unnecessarily. "Let her go," Marcus said quietly, applying just enough pressure to make his point without breaking bones. The man's response was a swing toward Marcus's head with his free hand. Marcus ducked, swept the attacker's legs, and put him on the ground in a single fluid motion. The second attacker came at him from the left, but Marcus had already spotted him in his peripheral vision and was ready with an elbow strike that sent the man stumbling backward. The third attacker proved more skilled, pulling a knife and moving with the controlled aggression of someone with combat training. Marcus found himself in a deadly dance he'd performed too many times before, reading his opponent's movements, staying just out of range of the blade while looking for an opening. Opening came when the knifeman overcommitted to a thrust aimed at Marcus's ribs. Marcus sidestepped, grabbed the attacker's wrist, and used his own momentum to send him sprawling into the stage equipment. The knife skittered away across the wooden platform, but even as Marcus neutralized the immediate threat to Ayanna, he could see through the clearing smoke that the attack was far from over. More men were moving through the confused crowd, heading toward the various booths where the other women were conducting their demonstrations. This wasn't random violence. It was a coordinated attempt to simultaneously target all 12 women. "Nayeli, get everyone to the community center," Marcus transmitted as he helped Ayanna down from the stage. "Lock the doors and wait for all clear. What about the festival? The visitors?" "The visitors will be fine once we remove the threat. Move." What followed was 15 minutes of controlled chaos as Marcus and his improvised security team moved through the festival grounds, identifying and neutralizing hostile actors while trying to minimize panic among the legitimate visitors. It was like urban combat in Afghanistan, except the non-combatants were families with children instead of villagers, and the stakes were cultural preservation instead of strategic objectives. Robert Crowfeather's grandson proved his worth by intercepting 2 men who were trying to force their way into the traditional crafts workshop, where several of the women had been working. The off-duty tribal police officers coordinated crowd control while pursuing attackers, who tried to blend into the confused mass of visitors. But it was the families and community members who truly made the difference. Elder women who had survived decades of government attempts to destroy their culture recognized the threat for what it was and responded with quiet, determined resistance. They formed protective circles around the younger women, created human barriers that forced the attackers to reveal themselves, and provided eyes and ears that no professional security system could match. Marcus found himself at the center of a battle that was about more than just physical protection. Every person who stood up to defend the festival, every elder who refused to be intimidated, every child who continued playing despite the chaos, was making a statement that their culture would not be silenced by fear. The turning point came when Brad Kowalski himself appeared near the museum building, clearly directing the operation through a tactical radio. Marcus had been hunting for the command element, knowing that cutting off the head would end the coordinated attack. Kowalski was good, professional, the kind of operator who'd learned his trade in places where mistakes meant death. But he'd made one crucial error. He'd underestimated the people he was attacking, seeing them as soft targets rather than a community with its own warrior tradition. When Marcus confronted him near the museum entrance, Kowalski smiled with the confidence of someone who'd always been the predator, never the prey. "Thompson, isn't it? Heard you were some kind of war hero. Let's see what you've got." The fight was brief but vicious. Kowalski had training, experience, and the advantage of being uninjured and well-rested. But Marcus had something more powerful: absolute certainty about what he was fighting for. These weren't abstract strategic objectives or political goals. They were 12 young women whose only crime was wanting to preserve something beautiful for future generations. When Kowalski hit the ground, unconscious and zip-tied with equipment from Marcus's own kit, the remaining attackers began melting away. Without coordination and leadership, their assault collapsed into scattered individuals trying to escape before tribal police and county sheriff's deputies arrived to sort out the chaos. Marcus keyed his radio for the final time that day. "All stations, threat neutralized. Begin crowd control and evidence preservation protocols." As emergency vehicles arrived and the last of the attackers were taken into custody, Marcus made his way to the community center where the 12 women had taken shelter. He found them huddled together, supporting each other through the aftermath of an attack that had tried to destroy not just their festival, but their sense of safety and purpose. Nayeli was the first to speak as Marcus entered the building. "Is it over?" Marcus looked at their faces, seeing fear but also something else. Determination. Defiance. The quiet strength that had carried their people through centuries of attempts to destroy their culture. "Yes," he said simply, "it's over." But even as he said the words, Marcus knew they weren't entirely true. This attack was over, this immediate threat neutralized. But the forces that had organized it, the attitudes that had motivated it, the systematic attempts to silence indigenous voices and steal indigenous lands, those would continue. What had changed was the response. The 12 young women had learned that they didn't have to face those forces alone. The community had demonstrated that it would stand together to protect what mattered most. Marcus Thompson had proven to himself that his scars and his skills still had purpose, that protection was still possible even in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything worth preserving. As sirens faded into the distance and the festival grounds slowly returned to normal, Marcus stood watch over 12 young women whose courage had inspired an entire community to remember what they were fighting for. The autumn festival would continue, the traditional songs would be sung, and the ancient stories would be passed on to another generation. Some battles were worth winning, no matter what they cost. Some people were worth protecting, even when protection seemed impossible. And sometimes, a scarred veteran with nothing left to lose could find exactly what he needed to win by standing between the darkness and the light, refusing to let either his own wounds or the world's cruelty define what was possible. But as the immediate danger receded, Marcus realized the true scope of what they'd faced. This hadn't been a simple hate crime or random act of violence. The coordination, the timing, the specific targeting of cultural preservation activities, it all pointed to something much larger and more sinister. Derek Hutchins arrived just as the last attacker was being loaded into a police vehicle. He came not as a participant, but as a concerned citizen, expressing shock and dismay at the violence that had disrupted such a peaceful cultural event. He had alibis, witnesses, plausible deniability for everything that had happened. "Terrible thing," he told the sheriff's deputies, shaking his head sadly. "Makes you wonder if these people can really handle the responsibility of self-governance. Maybe they need more oversight, more federal management to prevent this kind of chaos." Marcus watched from across the parking lot, recognizing the political theater for what it was. Hutchins had orchestrated the attack specifically to create this moment, this opportunity to portray the tribal community as unable to maintain order, as needing outside intervention to keep the peace. The mining company executives would read about the violence in tomorrow's newspapers. Federal bureaucrats would question whether the tribe was capable of managing the proposed copper extraction project. Politicians would cite security concerns as justification for increased oversight of tribal affairs. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind, designed to achieve through fear and manipulation what couldn't be accomplished through legal channels. Hutchins and his allies hadn't just been trying to hurt 12 young women. They'd been trying to destabilize an entire community's sense of autonomy and self-determination. As Marcus helped coordinate the scene cleanup, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Among the scattered festival programs and debris, someone had dropped a detailed floor plan of the cultural center's buildings. But it wasn't just any floor plan. It was an architectural drawing that showed ventilation systems, electrical layouts, and structural weaknesses that would only be known to someone with inside access. "Robert," Marcus called quietly to Crow, Feather, who was helping coordinate witness statements. "We need to talk. Privately." They stepped away from the crowd, and Marcus showed him the floor plan. Crowfeather's expression darkened as he studied the technical details. "This is from the Tribal Council's files," he said. "Building permits, renovation plans, security assessments. Someone with access to our official records provided this to the attackers." The implications were staggering. The attack hadn't just been externally organized. It had required inside information, tribal council documents, knowledge that could only have come from someone within the community's leadership structure. Marcus felt the familiar weight of betrayal settling on his shoulders. In Afghanistan, the worst missions were always the ones where you couldn't trust the people you were supposed to be protecting, where the enemy had infiltrated so deeply that every ally was potentially a threat. "Who has access to these files?" Marcus asked. "Tribal council members, obviously. Administrative staff, some federal liaison officers. A few outside consultants we've hired for various projects." Crowfeather paused, then added grimly, "And the law firm that represents us in our dispute with the mining company." Marcus studied the floor plan more carefully, noting specific markings that suggested someone had highlighted optimal entry points, security camera positions, and escape routes. This level of operational planning took time, resources, and most importantly, trust. Someone had spent months preparing for this attack, using their position within the tribal government to gather intelligence and coordinate with outside agitators. As they walked back toward the cultural center, Marcus noticed Naili standing near the main stage, staring at Ayana's mural backdrop. The artwork had been damaged during the attack, spray paint obscuring portions of the historical narrative, but the core images remained intact. "They tried to erase our story," Naili said quietly as Marcus approached. "Not just today, but that's what all of this has been about. Making us afraid to tell the truth about our history, our culture, our right to exist as sovereign people." Marcus nodded, understanding finally clicking into place. The harassment, the surveillance, the systematic targeting of the 12 women. It had never been about stopping individual activities. It had been about silencing an entire community's voice, about creating so much fear and chaos that the work of cultural preservation would grind to a halt. "But they failed," Ayana said, emerging from the community center with the other women. Despite the paint stains on her clothes and the exhaustion in her eyes, she carried herself with renewed determination. "We're still here. Our stories are still being told. And now the whole world knows what we're up against." She was right. The attack had backfired in ways Hutchins and his allies probably hadn't anticipated. News crews were already arriving to cover the violence, but instead of portraying the tribal community as chaotic and ungovernable, they were finding a story of resilience, community solidarity, and cultural preservation under fire. Winona had given an impromptu interview to a regional television station, explaining how her traditional medicine research was being targeted by people who saw indigenous knowledge as a threat to pharmaceutical profits. Kaya had sung a traditional song for the cameras, her young voice carrying across the festival grounds like a declaration that no amount of violence could silence her people's music. The 12 women who had been terrorized for months were transforming themselves into symbols of resistance, using the media attention generated by the attack to amplify their message rather than retreat into silence. But Marcus knew the real battle was just beginning. Hutchins and his allies had revealed their hand today, but they still had resources, connections, and motivation to continue their campaign. The inside information that had enabled today's attack suggested corruption that went deep into the tribal government structure. As evening fell over Pine Ridge, Marcus stood guard outside the community center where the 12 women were debriefing with tribal council members and federal investigators. He could hear their voices through the windows, strong and determined despite everything they'd endured. The autumn festival had been saved, but at a cost that went beyond the physical damage to buildings and equipment. These young women would never again feel completely safe in their own community. They would always remember that people who looked like neighbors and allies had been plotting their destruction, yet they were choosing to continue their work anyway, to preserve their traditions, tell their stories, and pass their knowledge on to the next generation. They were proving that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving forward despite being afraid. Marcus understood that feeling better than most. Every day since Afghanistan had been a choice between surrendering to fear and trauma, or finding some way to keep serving something larger than himself. Today, watching 12 young women refuse to be silenced by systematic harassment and organized violence, he'd been reminded why that choice mattered. The scars on his face and hands would never fully heal. The nightmares would probably never completely stop. But he'd found his purpose again in protecting people who deserved protection, in standing between predators and prey, in proving that some things were still worth fighting for. As stars began appearing in the clear South Dakota sky, Marcus Thompson settled in for another long night of standing watch. Somewhere in the darkness, enemies were regrouping, planning their next move, looking for new ways to destroy what these women were trying to preserve. But they would find Marcus waiting for them. Scarred, broken in some ways, but unbroken in the ways that mattered most. Ready to prove once again that some protectors never stop protecting, no matter what it cost them. The 12 maidens were safe. Their culture would survive. And Marcus Thompson had finally found his way home. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy more extensive than anyone had imagined. Within 48 hours of the attack, FBI agents specializing in domestic terrorism had descended on Pine Ridge, their presence signaling that this case had escalated far beyond local law enforcement capabilities. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being both a witness and a consultant, his military intelligence background making him valuable to investigators trying to understand the operational sophistication of the attack. He spent hours in sterile conference rooms, walking federal agents through the tactical details of what had unfolded during the festival. This wasn't militia weekend warriors playing soldier. Special Agent Lisa Santos explained to the gathered tribal council members on Monday morning. We're looking at a coordinated campaign involving multiple organizations, substantial funding, and access to classified government documents. The evidence room at the FBI field office looked like the aftermath of a major counterintelligence operation. Computers seized from Kowalski's security company contained detailed surveillance files on not just the 12 women, but dozens of tribal leaders across the region. Financial records showed payments from mining companies, real estate developers, and political action committees that had been funneling money through shell corporations to avoid detection. Most disturbing of all were the communications intercepts that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. The attack on the cultural center hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated campaign targeting indigenous communities across multiple states. Similar harassment campaigns were underway against tribal activists in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, all involving the same core group of organizers and financial backers. They call it the Heritage Preservation Initiative, Agent Santos explained, displaying intercepted emails on a projection screen. But the heritage they're trying to preserve is a mythology of American expansion that requires erasing the actual experiences of indigenous peoples. Marcus studied the communications with the analytical eye he'd once applied to enemy intelligence in Afghanistan. The language was carefully coded, designed to sound patriotic and reasonable to casual observers, while communicating clear instructions for harassment, intimidation, and violence to those who understood the real message. Derek Hutchins, it turned out, was merely a regional coordinator in a much larger network. The real organizers were based in Washington, D.C., working through think tanks and advocacy groups that presented themselves as concerned with government accountability and fiscal responsibility. Their funding came from corporations with interests in mining, oil extraction, and real estate development on or near tribal lands. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when investigators traced the source of the architectural plans that had been used to coordinate the attack. The documents had been leaked by James Clearwater, a tribal council member and the cousin of Raymond Clearwater, the Vietnam veteran who had voted to hire Marcus. James Clearwater had been feeding information to the conspirators for months, providing details about security measures, festival planning, and the personal routines of the 12 women. His motivation appeared to be financial. Bank records showed substantial payments from shell companies connected to the mining consortium. The betrayal hit the tribal community like a physical blow. James Clearwater was a respected member of the council, someone who had grown up on the reservation, whose children attended tribal schools, whose family had been part of the community for generations. The idea that he would sell out his own people for corporate money challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and loyalty. How do we move forward from this? Chief Whitefeather asked during an emergency council session. How do we preserve our community when we can't trust our own leaders? It was a question Marcus had wrestled with in Afghanistan, where local allies sometimes turned out to be enemy assets, where the people you were trying to protect might be the same people plotting your destruction. There were no easy answers, but there were lessons learned through bitter experience. You don't stop trusting everyone, Marcus said. You get better at verifying trust. You create systems that don't depend on any single person's integrity. You build in redundancies and safeguards. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with the tribal council to implement new security protocols that went far beyond physical protection. Document access was restricted and monitored. Financial oversight was strengthened. Outside consultants and contractors were subjected to more thorough background investigations. But the most important changes were cultural rather than procedural. The attack had awakened something in the community, a recognition that passive resistance and quiet dignity weren't always enough to protect what mattered most. Sometimes active defense was necessary. The 12 young women became the symbols and catalysts of this cultural shift. Rather than retreating from public view or scaling back their activities, they expanded their work and embraced their role as the voice of their generation's determination to preserve tribal heritage. Ayana, Broken Wing's damaged mural, became a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing visitors from across the region who wanted to see the artwork that someone had tried so hard to destroy. She left the spray paint damage visible as part of the composition, transforming the act of vandalism into a statement about resilience and survival. Winona Ghosthorse's research into traditional medicine gained national attention when major pharmaceutical companies attempted to suppress her work through legal challenges and academic pressure. Instead of backing down, she partnered with sympathetic researchers at major universities, creating a network of scholars dedicated to preserving and documenting indigenous medical knowledge. Nayeli Rainwater emerged as a powerful advocate for tribal sovereignty, using her legal training to challenge the systemic inequities that had enabled the conspiracy against her community. She testified before congressional committees, spoke at law schools, and built coalitions with other indigenous rights advocates across the country. Each of the 12 women found ways to transform their trauma into purpose, their fear into determination. They had learned something that Marcus understood from his own experience with combat stress. Survival wasn't just about enduring trauma, but about finding ways to use that experience to protect others from facing the same threats. The broader impact rippled outward in ways no one had anticipated. The FBI investigation had exposed similar harassment campaigns in other states, leading to arrests and prosecutions that dismantled networks of anti-indigenous activists. Congressional hearings were launched to investigate the connections between corporate interests and domestic terrorism, targeting tribal communities. Media coverage of the Pine Ridge attack had also shifted public perception in subtle but significant ways. Instead of the usual narratives about tribal dysfunction and dependency, news outlets were telling stories about cultural preservation, community resilience, and the ongoing struggle for indigenous rights in modern America. Marcus found himself reluctantly in the spotlight as well, featured in magazine articles and television interviews as an example of how veterans could find purpose by protecting vulnerable communities. He deflected most of the attention, preferring to focus media coverage on the women he was protecting rather than himself. But privately, he understood that his own healing had accelerated dramatically since arriving at Pine Ridge. The nightmares hadn't disappeared, but they came less frequently. The hypervigilance that had made civilian employment impossible was actually an asset in his current role. The guilt and shame that had consumed him since Afghanistan were being transformed into something more constructive. "You've changed," Nayeli observed one evening as they reviewed security protocols for an upcoming conference on indigenous education. "When you first arrived, you carried yourself like someone who was broken. Now you move like someone who knows his purpose." Marcus considered her words as he looked out over the cultural center grounds. The physical damage from the attack had been repaired, but more importantly, the sense of vulnerability and isolation that had plagued the community for months had been replaced by something stronger. "I think we all changed," he replied. "The attack was supposed to break us, make us afraid to continue our work. Instead, it proved that this community is worth defending, that the work you're doing is important enough for powerful people to see it as a threat." The autumn evening was peaceful, with the first hints of winter beginning to touch the prairie grass. In a few hours, Marcus would begin his nightly security rounds, checking perimeters and monitoring systems with the methodical precision that had become second nature. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The 12 young women who had been terrorized for months were safe. Their work continued, stronger and more visible than ever. The community that had been divided by betrayal was healing, building new bonds of trust and solidarity. The enemies who had orchestrated the attack were in federal custody, their networks exposed and dismantled. The corporate interests that had funded the harassment campaign were facing congressional investigation and public scrutiny. The mythology of American expansion that required erasing indigenous voices was being challenged by a new generation of Native advocates who refused to be silenced. Marcus Thompson had found his way home, not to a place but to a purpose. The scars on his face and hands told stories of sacrifice and survival. But more importantly, they marked him as someone who had learned that protection was possible, that hope could survive even the darkest circumstances, that broken people could still stand between innocence and evil. The 12 maidens were safe. Their culture was not just surviving but thriving. And somewhere in the vast South Dakota night, a scarred veteran stood watch, ready to prove once again that some things were worth protecting, no matter what it cost. 3 months after the attack, the Cultural Center hosted its largest event ever, a regional conference on indigenous rights and cultural preservation. Representatives from dozens of tribes attended, along with scholars, activists, and federal officials interested in understanding the challenges facing Native communities. Marcus watched from the security office as Ayanna presented her research on traditional art techniques to a packed auditorium. Winona led a workshop on traditional medicine that drew participants from across the academic and medical communities. Nayeli moderated a panel discussion on sovereignty and self-determination that would be broadcast on National Public Radio. All 12 women had become more than they'd ever imagined when they first started working at the Cultural Center. They were teachers, advocates, symbols of resilience who carried their people's heritage into an uncertain future with courage and determination. The death threats had stopped. The surveillance had ended. The organized harassment campaign had been dismantled. But more importantly, the community had learned that it could defend itself, that it didn't have to passively endure. Attempts to destroy its culture and values. Marcus keyed his radio for the evening security check-in. All stations report status. One by one, his security team confirmed that all was well. The perimeter was secure. The buildings were protected. The women were safe. It had taken a scarred war veteran with nothing left to lose to remind a community what protection looked like. But in the end, it was the community itself that had provided the real security, the unbreakable bonds of culture and kinship that no amount of outside pressure could destroy. The autumn festival would return next year, bigger and better than ever. The traditional songs would be sung, the ancient stories told, the sacred dances performed, and 12 young women would continue their work of preservation and hope, protected not just by sophisticated security systems and federal investigations, but by the knowledge that their community would never again allow them to face their enemies alone. Marcus Thompson had finally found his place in the world, not as a broken veteran carrying guilt and shame, but as a guardian standing between what was precious and what threatened to destroy it. The war in Afghanistan was over, but the mission of protection continued. And for the first time since Rodriguez and Patterson had died in that distant village, Marcus understood that their sacrifice had meaning, that the skills they'd died for were still needed, still valuable, still capable of saving lives that mattered. But the resolution brought unexpected complications that tested the community's newfound solidarity in ways no one had anticipated. The media attention, while largely positive, also attracted unwanted scrutiny from federal agencies and corporate interests, who saw the Pine Ridge success as a threat to their broader agenda. Within 6 weeks of the arrests, the Department of Interior announced a comprehensive review of tribal cultural preservation programs, ostensibly to ensure proper oversight of federal funding. The review team arrived with briefcases full of regulations and requirements that would effectively bureaucratize the spontaneous, community-driven work that had made the cultural center so effective. They're trying to accomplish through paperwork what they couldn't achieve through violence, Nayeli observed during a tense meeting with federal reviewers. Regulate us into irrelevance, tie us up in red tape until we can't function effectively. Marcus recognized the strategy from his military experience. When direct confrontation failed, bureaucratic warfare often proved more effective at achieving strategic objectives. The attack had failed to shut down the cultural center, but federal regulations might succeed where terrorism had not. The 12 women found themselves spending increasing amounts of time filling out compliance reports, attending mandatory training sessions, and documenting their activities in ways that felt more like surveillance than oversight. The spontaneous creativity that had driven their work was being systematically replaced by procedural requirements that drained energy and enthusiasm. Ayana's art classes were suspended for 3 weeks, while federal inspectors evaluated whether her traditional techniques met contemporary safety standards. When known as traditional medicine, research was subjected to pharmaceutical industry protocols that treated indigenous knowledge as unproven folk remedies rather than sophisticated healing systems, refined over centuries. Even more troubling were the personal consequences that emerged as the investigation expanded. James Clearwater's betrayal had fractured family relationships throughout the community. His immediate family faced ostracism and suspicion, despite having no knowledge of his activities. His children were bullied at school, his wife lost her job at the tribal health clinic, and his elderly parents faced whispered accusations in the grocery store. This is what collaboration does to a community, Elder Thomas Stronghart observed during a council meeting. It doesn't just hurt the traitors. It makes everyone suspicious of everyone else, breaks down the trust that holds us together. Marcus found himself mediating disputes that had nothing to do with external security, but everything to do with internal healing. Family members who had trusted James Clearwater felt betrayed not just by him, but by their own judgment. Community leaders questioned every decision, wondering what other infiltration might have occurred. The psychological warfare that had begun with harassment and escalated to violence was continuing through legal and bureaucratic channels. The same corporate interests that had funded the original conspiracy were now using federal agencies and congressional allies to achieve their objectives through official channels. Marcus's own past came under renewed scrutiny as well. Investigative journalists researching the Pine Ridge story discovered his employment troubles since leaving the military, his struggles with PTSD, his history of workplace conflicts. Some articles portrayed him as an unstable veteran whose violent response to the festival attack had escalated a situation that might have been resolved peacefully. Marcus Thompson, hero or liability? Read one headline in a national magazine. The article questioned whether someone with his psychological profile should be entrusted with protecting vulnerable community members, suggesting that his military training made him more likely to see threats where none existed. The criticism stung, particularly because it echoed his own self-doubts from the dark months after his discharge. But it also revealed something important about the broader conflict they were facing. The same forces that had attacked the cultural center were now trying to discredit its defenders, using Marcus's personal struggles as ammunition in a larger propaganda war. "They're trying to make you doubt yourself again," Nayeli told him after a particularly brutal television interview where a talking head had psychoanalyzed his combat record. "They want you to go back to thinking you're broken, unreliable, dangerous. Because if you believe that, you'll stop protecting us." The insight was profound and liberating. Marcus realized that his recovery hadn't just been personal. It had been political. A broken veteran who found purpose and healing through service was a threat to narratives that portrayed veterans as damaged goods, indigenous communities as helpless victims, and corporate interests as legitimate stakeholders. In tribal affairs, the real battle wasn't just about protecting 12 young women or preserving cultural traditions. It was about proving that healing was possible, that communities could defend themselves, that ordinary people with extraordinary courage could stand against institutional power and win. This understanding transformed how Marcus approached both his security responsibilities and his public role. Instead of avoiding media attention, he began using interviews and speaking engagements to tell a different story about veterans, trauma, and recovery. He spoke at VA hospitals about finding purpose through service, at tribal colleges about security and protection, at law enforcement conferences about community-based approaches to public safety. The 12 women, meanwhile, were developing their own sophisticated understanding of the forces arrayed against them. They began coordinating with indigenous activists across the country, sharing strategies for dealing with harassment, bureaucratic obstruction, and media manipulation. What had started as individual efforts to preserve specific traditions evolved into a coordinated movement for indigenous rights and cultural sovereignty. Ayana's art installations began appearing in major museums, but always with explicit political messages about ongoing attempts to suppress indigenous voices. Winona's medical research attracted international attention, forcing pharmaceutical companies to acknowledge the sophistication and effectiveness of traditional healing systems. Kaya's traditional songs were recorded and distributed widely, carrying messages of resistance and resilience to indigenous communities worldwide. The cultural center became a hub for this broader movement, hosting conferences, training workshops, and strategic planning sessions that brought together activists, scholars, and tribal leaders from across North America. What had begun as a local cultural preservation project had evolved into a model for indigenous self-determination and community defense. Federal agencies that had arrived to impose bureaucratic control found themselves dealing with a sophisticated network of legal advocates, media specialists, and political organizers who understood how to navigate complex regulatory systems while maintaining their core mission. The 12 women who had once been vulnerable targets were now experienced activists, who could hold their own in congressional hearings and university symposiums. The transformation wasn't without costs. The constant vigilance required to defend against bureaucratic attacks was exhausting. The media attention brought both supporters and new enemies. The political prominence of the cultural center made it a target for activists and politicians who opposed indigenous rights for ideological or economic reasons. But 6 months after the Autumn Festival attack, as Marcus conducted his evening security rounds, he could see evidence of victory everywhere. The cultural center's programs had not just survived, but expanded. The 12 women were not just safe, but thriving as leaders and advocates. The community had not just healed from betrayal, but strengthened its bonds through shared struggle. Most importantly, the broader movement for indigenous rights had gained momentum and visibility that would have been impossible without the courage demonstrated during those crucial moments when everything hung in the balance. The attack had failed not just tactically, but strategically. Energizing rather than intimidating the people, it was designed to silence. Marcus paused at the memorial garden that had been planted where the dead hawk was found. 12 native plants, one for each of the women, grew in a circle around a simple stone marker inscribed with words in Lakota that translated to, "They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds." The metaphor captured something essential about what had happened here. Violence intended to destroy had instead planted something that grew stronger through resistance. Fear meant to silence had instead amplified voices that carried messages of hope and determination across the continent. As winter settled over the South Dakota prairie, Marcus Thompson stood watch over a community that had learned the difference between surviving and thriving, between enduring oppression and actively resisting it. The 12 maidens were not just safe, they were powerful. Their culture was not just preserved, it was alive and growing. And somewhere in the vast darkness beyond the cultural center's lights, the forces that had tried to destroy this community were learning a lesson that Marcus had first encountered in the villages of Afghanistan. Some things are worth protecting. Some people refuse to be intimidated. And some protectors never stop standing guard. The 12 maidens were safe. The mission continued. The watch would never end. 1 year after the Autumn Festival attack, Marcus Thompson stood before a congressional subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, his scarred hands resting on a polished mahogany table as senators and representatives leaned forward to hear his testimony. The hearing room was packed with veterans advocates, tribal leaders, and media representatives who had come to witness what many considered a pivotal moment in discussions about veteran rehabilitation and community service. Chairman Morrison. "Distinguished members of the committee," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I'm here today not as a war hero or a victim of combat trauma, but as living proof that broken doesn't mean useless, that damage doesn't mean disposable, and that the skills we learn in war can be transformed into tools for peace." The journey from that sterile VA office in Denver to this congressional hearing room had been longer and more complex than anyone could have imagined. What had started as Marcus's last chance at employment had evolved into a national model for veteran rehabilitation, community security, and cultural preservation that was being studied and replicated across the country. The Pine Ridge Cultural Center had become more than a workplace for Marcus and a safe haven for 12 young women. It had become a symbol of what was possible when communities took responsibility for their own protection, when veterans found purpose beyond their trauma, and when cultural preservation became an act of resistance against forces that sought to erase indigenous voices from the American narrative. Dr. Sarah Chun, a psychiatrist from Walter Reed Medical Center, had spent 6 months studying the Pine Ridge model for her research on post-traumatic stress recovery. Her findings, published in the Journal of Military Medicine, had challenged fundamental assumptions about how veterans healed from combat trauma. Traditional therapy focuses on helping veterans adjust to civilian life, Dr. Chun had written. But what we saw at Pine Ridge suggests that some veterans heal more effectively when they're able to continue serving in roles that utilize their military skills while protecting communities that genuinely need their expertise. The research had profound implications for how the Department of Veterans Affairs approached rehabilitation. Instead of trying to help veterans forget their military experience, programs inspired by the Pine Ridge model encouraged veterans to transform their combat skills into community protection capabilities. Marcus had become an unlikely spokesman for this approach, speaking at VA hospitals and veteran organizations across the country. But he always insisted that the real heroes of the story were the 12 women whose courage and determination had created the conditions for healing to occur. Nayeli Rainwater is now a federal prosecutor specializing in crimes against indigenous communities. Marcus told the Congressional Committee. Ayanna Brokenwing's artwork hangs in the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. Winona Ghosthurst's research has been incorporated into medical school curricula at 7 major universities. He paused, looking directly at the committee members. These women didn't need me to rescue them. They needed someone who understood that some things are worth protecting, who had the skills to stand between them and the forces trying to silence them, and who was willing to learn from them about resilience, community, and the difference between surviving and thriving. The Pine Ridge model had been adapted for use in dozens of communities across the United States. Veterans were being paired with schools facing violence, community centers dealing with gang activity, houses of worship threatened by hate crimes, and historical sites targeted by vandalism. The program had achieved remarkable success rates, both in terms of veteran rehabilitation and community protection. But perhaps more importantly, it had begun to change how America thought about both veterans and the communities they served. Veterans were no longer seen primarily as victims needing charity, but as skilled professionals whose expertise in protection and security could benefit vulnerable populations. Communities were no longer passive recipients of federal assistance, but active participants in their own defense and preservation. The 12 women had played crucial roles in developing and promoting this new model. They traveled to conferences, consulted with other communities, and shared their experiences through books, documentaries, and academic research. Their story had become part of university curricula in fields ranging from social work to national security studies. Sidla Lee Morningstar, now 20 and a sophomore at Harvard studying international relations, had testified before the United Nations Committee on Indigenous Rights about the systematic harassment her community had faced and overcome. Her presentation had led to formal UN recognition of cultural preservation as a fundamental human right requiring international protection. Kaya Blue Eagle had become the youngest person ever to receive the National Heritage Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, recognition for her work in preserving and revitalizing traditional Lakota songs and stories. Her performances at major cultural venues across the country drew audiences who had never been exposed to indigenous traditions, building bridges between communities that had historically viewed each other with suspicion or indifference. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual achievements. The successful defense of the Pine Ridge Cultural Center had inspired indigenous communities across North America to take more proactive approaches to protecting their cultural heritage. Traditional knowledge that had been carefully guarded within families and communities was being documented, shared, and celebrated as part of humanity's collective wisdom. Museums that had historically collected indigenous artifacts without community consent were being forced to reconsider their practices. Academic institutions were developing new protocols for researching indigenous communities that emphasized collaboration rather than extraction. Even pharmaceutical companies were beginning to acknowledge indigenous communities as partners rather than sources of raw material for drug development. Marcus found himself at the center of these changes, serving on advisory boards and consulting with organizations that were trying to understand how the Pine Ridge model could be applied to their own challenges. But he remained grounded in the daily work of protection, still conducting security rounds, still training community members in basic safety protocols, still standing watch over a place that had become sacred to him. The physical scars on his face and hands remained unchanged, permanent reminders of that terrible day in Afghanistan when Rodriguez and Patterson had died protecting a village full of strangers. But the meaning of those scars had been transformed. They were no longer symbols of failure and loss, but evidence of his willingness to pay the price for protection, proof that he understood the cost of standing between innocence and evil. Nightmares still came occasionally, but they were different now. Instead of replaying scenes of death and destruction, they often featured the 12 women he'd sworn to protect, showing them in danger while he was unable to reach them. These dreams left him tired but determined rather than despairing, reminding him that his purpose was about preventing future tragedies rather than erasing past ones. The most important lesson we learned at Pine Ridge, Marcus told a gathering of social workers and community organizers in Chicago, is that healing happens in community. Not in isolation, not through individual therapy alone, but through connecting people who need protection with people who have the skills to provide it. He gestured to Nayeli, who was co-presenting with him at the conference. Ms. Rainwater and her colleagues taught me that protection isn't just about stopping bad things from happening. It's about creating conditions where good things can flourish. Art, music, traditional knowledge, cultural practices that have survived. Genocide and forced assimilation. These things need active protection if they're going to survive and thrive. The audience included veterans, social workers, tribal leaders, and community organizers from across the Midwest. They had come to learn about the Pine Ridge model, but Marcus suspected many would leave with a deeper understanding of how individual healing and community protection were interconnected processes that required both professional skills and personal commitment. After the presentation, a young veteran approached Marcus with questions that sounded familiar. Recently discharged from the Army, struggling with civilian employment, dealing with nightmares and hypervigilance that made normal life feel impossible. The conversation reminded Marcus of his own dark period after leaving the military, the sense of purposelessness and disconnection that had nearly destroyed him. The hardest part, the young veteran said, is feeling like all my training, all my experience, everything I learned about protecting people, none of it matters anymore. Like society wants me to forget I was ever a soldier and just blend into some civilian life that feels meaningless. Marcus understood the feeling completely. What if I told you that's not true? What if there are communities right now that need exactly the skills you have, people who would see your training as a gift rather than a liability? He handed the veteran a business card for the Pine Ridge Veterans Assistance Program, an organization that had grown out of his own experience to help connect former military personnel with communities that needed protection services. We're not the only place doing this kind of work anymore. There are programs in 37 states now, all based on the same principle. Your skills matter, your experience has value, and there are people who need what you have to offer. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering practical details about applications and training programs, but also touching on deeper questions about purpose, meaning, and the difference between serving in war and serving in peace. By the end, the young veteran was standing straighter, asking specific questions about how to get involved, rather than general questions about whether life was worth living. These interactions had become a regular part of Marcus's life, connecting with veterans who were struggling with the same sense of disconnection and purposelessness that had nearly consumed him. Each conversation was a reminder of how far he'd traveled from that desperate morning in the VA office when Janet Walsh had offered him one last chance. The flight back to South Dakota gave Marcus time to reflect on how profoundly his life had changed since that autumn day when he'd first arrived at Pine Ridge. The scared, broken veteran who had stumbled off the Greyhound bus had been transformed into someone who understood his purpose, valued his experience, and saw his scars as badges of honor rather than marks of shame. But the transformation hadn't been his alone. The 12 women had evolved from vulnerable targets into powerful advocates whose voices carried across the continent. The Pine Ridge Cultural Center had grown from a local community organization into a model for indigenous self-determination. That was being studied and replicated worldwide. Most importantly, the relationship between veterans and the communities they served had been redefined in ways that benefited everyone involved. Veterans found purpose and healing through meaningful service. Communities gained access to professional protection services that respected their values and supported their goals. And society as a whole began to understand that the skills developed in military service could be assets rather than liabilities in civilian life. As the plane descended toward the small airport that served the Pine Ridge area, Marcus could see the cultural center's buildings in the distance, their lights glowing like beacons against the vast darkness of the South Dakota prairie. Somewhere in those buildings, 12 women were continuing the work of cultural preservation that had nearly cost them their lives. Their determination to preserve and share their heritage had created the conditions for Marcus's own healing, proving that protection was always a reciprocal relationship. The scarred war veteran who had been given one last chance had discovered that sometimes the people you're protecting are also protecting you. The young women who had sought his protection had taught him that strength came not from hiding wounds, but from transforming them into wisdom, not from forgetting the past, but from using it to build a better future. Marcus Thompson was coming home to a place where his scars told stories of courage rather than failure, where his skills were valued rather than feared, where his purpose was clear and his mission continued every day. The 12 maidens were safe, their culture was thriving, and their protector had finally found the peace that comes from knowing that some things are always worth defending. In the end, it had never been about saving them or being saved by them. It had been about discovering that healing happens in community, that protection flows both ways, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them and yourself into something better than anyone thought possible. The watch continued, but now it was shared by a community that understood the difference between surviving and flourishing, between existing and truly living. And in that understanding lay the seeds of hope that would continue growing long after the current generation had passed the responsibility to those who would come after. Some stories end with victory. Some end with healing. The best ones end with the promise that both are possible, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they find their purpose, and that the most important battles are often fought not with weapons, but with courage, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to protecting what matters most. Marcus Thompson had found his way home. The 12 maidens had found their voices, and together they had proven that some things, culture, community, hope itself, are worth any sacrifice required to preserve them for future generations who would need their light in whatever darkness lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.